3 counties, 24 cities, working together, accomplishing more than any of us could alone. Whether your roots run generations deep, or you recently moved to Greater Portland, you are a part of Metro, the nation's only regional government elected by the people. Planning for the future, preserving what we love. Let's keep our region thriving for decades to come.
Hello, I'm Rory. You may have seen me at my desk as you came into the Metro Regional Center. Welcome. The Council Chambers is located on the 3rd floor of this building. In the event of a fire or a fire alarm, please exit through the northeast corner of the room. Go down the steps to the 2nd floor, then continue straight ahead past my desk and exit through the main entrance to the plaza outside. The nearest defibrillator is located right outside of the front desk at the top of the steps to Grand Avenue. Thanks for joining us at the Metro Regional Center. We hope you have a safe day.
The business meeting to order. I will now ask our clerk, Georgia Langa, to please call the roll for attendance.
Absolutely. Councillor Nolan?
Present.
Councillor Rosenthal?
Present.
Councillor Lewis?
Present.
Councillor Simpson?
Present.
Council President Gonzalez?
Present. Good morning.
Councillor Palacios is excused today, and Deputy Council President Wong.
Present. Thank you. Okay, let's go to public communications. We'll now open up public communications on non-agenda items. Georgia, will you please describe to the audience our procedures that we will use for public communications?
Yes, if you're testifying on non-agenda items, now is the time to do so. If you are testifying in person, please sign up by filling out a blue card in the back of the room and bringing it up to me. If you're testifying on Zoom or by phone, please sign up by using the raise hand function in the reactions or more menus or by dialing *9. When it's your turn to testify, I will call on your name or phone number. For those on Zoom, click accept to be promoted to a panelist. Your Zoom window will close briefly before you rejoin as a panelist, and you can turn on your camera if you'd like. Testimony is limited to 3 minutes. Time begins when you begin speaking. Please state your name for the record before testifying. You do not need to give your physical address. If you are testifying on an agenda item and have not signed up in advance, you can do so by filling out a blue card or raising your hand anytime before the agenda item, but we just have consent today. I'm not seeing anyone with their hands raised in the virtual audience. I don't see anyone in the physical audience today. Deputy Council President.
Okay, we'll close public testimony. We'll move on to our consent agenda. Bear with me here. We have 7 items on today's consent agenda before we head into our August recess, starting with resolution number 26-5627 for the purpose of authorizing a cell tower lease at the M. James Gleason Memorial Boat Ramp. Resolution number 26-5628 for purpose of confirming the appointment of members to the Zoo Bond Oversight Committee. Consideration of a July 2nd, 2026 council meeting minutes. Consideration of a July 9th, 2026 council meeting minutes. Consideration of a July 16th, 2026 council meeting minutes. Consideration of the July 21st, 2026 council meeting minutes. And consideration of a July 23rd, 2026 council meeting minutes. Is there a motion on the consent agenda?
I move consent.
Second.
Okay, it's moved by Councilor Lewis, seconded by Councilor Simpson. All in favor say aye.
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 Okay, all opposed say nay. Okay, the consent agenda passes unanimously. Okay, we're gonna then adjourn to a work session. So we'll adjourn the Metro Council meeting and call it to order a work session. And colleagues, I think at this point, I just want to get your blessing to switch the order of the agenda items. Our speaker for the economic development portion is currently at City Council, so I'd like to start with the affordable housing assessment. Is that okay with you all? Okay. Great. So Council has repeatedly identified continued investment in affordable housing as one of our top strategic priorities. Today's discussion is an important milestone in advancing that priority. It will help build the foundation needed to inform future policy and investment decisions, while also delivering on our commitments to Metro's regional housing coordination strategy. The Regional Affordable Housing Assessment brings together 6 interconnected work streams designed to provide the analysis and insights needed to support our future decisions. We have our Housing Director, Liam Frost, and Housing Policy Director, Emily Lieb, who are here to introduce the assessment and walk us through the work ahead.
Good morning, Deputy Council President Wong. Good morning, councillors. For the record, my name is Liam Frost. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am the Metro Housing Director, and it's a pleasure to be with you again this week. Today's presentation is really to start a conversation in earnest with Council around the next stage, or the bridge to the future, as it were, focused in on the Regional Affordable Housing Assessment. Go to the next slide, please, Georgia. You all may recall that you recently received an update on the progress of the 2018 housing bond during a presentation on the annual report. Today's discussion builds on that, but it is distinct in that it represents, as I mentioned, a bridge to the future, and it also follows through on commitments that we've collectively made in the Regional Housing Coordination Strategy as well. Next slide, please. So over the past decade, as you're well aware, the region has significantly expanded its housing investments, policy tools, and regional partnerships. Affordable housing, supportive housing, and state and regional policy reforms have increasingly become part of a more integrated housing system. And what this implicitly and explicitly represents is that collectively we were fed up of waiting for the federal government to return to its level of investments prior to the late 70s. You'll see at the very beginning here, the 2016 Portland bond measure was one of the major milestones in kicking off that local response. We're fortunate in the housing department to have one of the main architects of that bond sitting here in this room, Israel Baer, who continues to work on this work. And I'm very proud to be sitting next to Emily Lieb, who designed and put together the architecture for the regional bond that was passed by voters in 2018. And in some ways, I'm tempted to say, this is full circle as I've observed Emily's work, and certainly is coming to that full circle of the bond work, but by no means does it indicate an ending of our work regionally in building up housing systems. This is still very much beginning. We have really strong shoots, and we are hoping to build them up into much stronger infrastructure in the future, and that's what the Affordable Housing Assessment is going to help us to do. Next slide, please. As we embarked upon these changes over the last 10 years, the landscape has also changed too. And you'll recall 10 years ago when the area was really booming, that investment was being attracted, that a lot of our neighbors were not benefiting from some of those economic benefits. Right now, and you'll hear it in the agenda item after hours, around how the economy is no longer booming locally. And in fact, it has plateaued, and growth is not a thing that is really happening right now. And again, our neighbors are suffering from that. They have very limited access to advance economically, and then all the ancillary supports are disappearing that have been funded federally. And so that local response is continuously needed in boom times and at times where our economy is struggling. This regional affordable housing assessment's a year-long process. I'm excited about it. Oftentimes we come to council and we tell you what has happened. This time we're going to tell you what is going to happen. We want to be full partners with council. And again, I'm very proud to be sitting next to Emily Lieb here, who's going to be walking you through the main 6 bodies of work that are represented in the assessment.
Great, next slide, please. For the record, I'm Emily Lieb, Housing Policy and Bond Director, and I'm going to walk through the bodies of work in the assessment. Together, these bodies of work examine different aspects of a regional housing system, and as Liam framed up, they are intended to build a shared evidence base for future policy, funding, and implementation decisions. This work is being led by the Housing Department in close coordination with our partners in Planning, Development, and Research and other Metro departments, drawing on expertise across the organization where appropriate. So I'll briefly walk through each of these projects and our proposed approach to council engagement, and then we will open it up for discussion. Next slide, please. The first work stream looks at those broader market, economic, and policy changes in the environment in which affordable housing is being developed and operated today. Over the past several years, we've seen significant changes in construction costs, financing conditions, insurance rates, labor markets, and broader housing market dynamics. At the same time, the need for affordable housing has continued to evolve. This work will help us better understand how those conditions are affecting affordable housing feasibility, delivery mechanisms, and long-term sustainability, and where the greatest opportunities and constraints exist. This will build on existing housing needs analyses and other research, and will examine not only what the region needs, but also the market and policy conditions shaping what gets built, who gets served, and where future policy and investment can have the greatest impact. Next slide, please. Ultimately, affordable housing is about improving people's lives, and the best way to understand whether we're achieving that is to ask the people who live there. So we're very excited to have a body of work in our work plan for this year to conduct a resident survey to gather information from residents in affordable housing that help us understand their experiences in their homes with the buildings and neighborhoods and the services and operations of affordable housing, and how those experiences vary across people and places. This work is intended to complement the quantitative analysis and market research we'll be doing to help ensure that future policy and investment decisions are centered around the people we are seeking to serve. Next slide, please. So the next body of work focuses on housing access and geographic considerations. These are interrelated work streams that really look at where affordable housing is located and how people gain access to it. Through this work, we will be evaluating how different geographic considerations, neighborhood characteristics, and housing access policies and strategies shape outcomes for residents, providers, and for the broader system. This includes looking at questions like where housing is being developed, how tenant selection and affirmative marketing practices are working on the ground, and how different approaches influence housing choice, equitable access, and long-term outcomes. Rather than starting with predetermined conclusions, we'll be evaluating evidence and identifying lessons learned that can help inform future policy and investment. Next slide, please. So the next body of work focuses on a review of the 2018 Affordable Housing Bond. Throughout the implementation of the bond, we've continually learned and adapted based on experience and feedback and evolving conditions. This body of work is intended to provide an opportunity to take a step back and synthesize those lessons learned across the program in partnership with our implementation partners, providers, and the Housing Bond Oversight Committee. We expect that there will be many areas of broad consensus, as well as some areas with a range of perspectives. And by bringing those together into a shared understanding, we can help inform future investment and funding decisions. Next slide, please. I think this is the fifth body of work, looks beyond today's delivery models to better understand where innovation may help to address some of the challenges we're seeing in the housing system. So we will be evaluating a broad range of emerging approaches, including construction methods that could bring down the cost of building affordable housing, different financing tools and ownership models, as well as operating approaches to understand where those approaches show promise and under what circumstances they might be effective. Our goal here isn't to promote a particular model. It's really to build a stronger evidence base around what works and what trade-offs different approaches might involve, and where innovation has the potential to reduce costs, improve resident outcomes, or accelerate housing delivery. These findings will help inform future policy and investment discussions along with the other bodies of work in the assessment. Next slide, please. The final body of work is our operational stabilization work. So while the other areas of work in this assessment are fully looking toward setting the stage for the future, this body of work is also responding to urgent challenges facing the affordable housing system today. This work stream focuses on supporting regional efforts to stabilize the affordable housing system, identify near-term opportunities for action, and inform longer-term strategies to strengthen its sustainability. This work is intended to be action-oriented, so we will be documenting and understanding the challenges, but more importantly, working with partners to identify coordinated responses. Those may include operational improvements, regulatory changes, funding strategies, or legislative actions at the local, regional, state, or federal level. We're currently working with Housing Oregon, Housing Development Center, Network of Oregon Affordable Housing, Enterprise Community Partners, and other partners across the region to define the appropriate structure and role for Metro in supporting that work. Next slide, please. This is our final slide, and then we'll get to questions. This work is really designed as an ongoing conversation with the council, rather than a report that we're going to bring you at the end of the process. We anticipate returning to council approximately quarterly, both to surface emerging findings and even just to support discussions. We hope to dive into a different topic with each work session, topic or topics. And rather than just bringing you staff presentations, we are also hoping to bring together researchers, practitioners, and other experts to support panel discussions so that the council can hear directly a range of perspectives and engage with the people doing the work. Some of those conversations, like operational stabilization this fall, will also focus on near-term challenges and opportunities. That's particularly important because part of that work will be oriented around preparing for the coordinated legislative agenda for housing and homelessness that the council approved in the RHCS that will be coming together in support of the 2027 long session. Other topics will be, exploring topics like innovation, resident experiences, geographic strategies, and implementation lessons learned. So we will be continuing to engage with the council to shape that strategy, but this is an anticipated schedule, and by next summer, we will also be packaging those findings together into an integrated set of findings to support future policy and funding discussions. And with that, we can go to the next slide, and we have some discussion questions.
If I could just conclude this presentation as you consider these questions here. This is definitely aligned with the Regional Housing Coordination Strategy. It is timed as the bond is fully committed. And ultimately, it is in response to Council's prioritization exercise last fall, I believe, at one retreat, wherein Council identified continuous funding for affordable housing. And so the Housing Department wants to be able to prepare and serve this Council so that you can make the appropriate decision at the right time. And the Affordable Housing Assessment represents that work.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for the presentation. Let's go with discussion and questions. Colleagues, anything? Start with Councilor Rosenthal.
Oh, sure, since nobody was raising their hand, thank you. This is great. I think I'm looking forward to seeing this assessment. I think it's going to be a lot of work. Sort of a background question is, which you can answer or not, is do we have the right tools, or does the legislature have the right tools to allow us to move forward appropriately, or are we going to have to make a lot of mid-season adjustments? But my big question has to do with small communities. And one of the things I didn't see specifically called out is, as you know, I mean, as we all know, that the cities, many of the cities have to do their own regional or their own local housing coordination strategies or housing needs assessments. And as you all know, each city has its own personality and its own attitude toward housing and its own attitude toward different levels of housing and different kinds of housing. So how exactly is that going to be brought into this and coordinate? And you had a slide up there that said coordinated 6 issues and a coordinated strategy. I'm just wondering, tongue in cheek, is that going to be an uncoordinated strategy? Because the cities don't always have the same ideas.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll answer your first question, and then I'll hand it over to Emily to answer your second one. With regard to do we have the right tools either at the legislature or locally, I think what I've observed over the last 5 to 10 years is that there's been tremendous resources, energy, and time given into housing policy and trying to serve folks that need affordable housing. I'm particularly excited about the agenda item that follows this agenda item because those are the tools really that are going to help put less pressure on the affordable housing sector to solve the larger problems. And by that, I mean flipping the question of why don't we have enough housing for people who are in poverty, and then asking the question, why do we have so many people in poverty? And so my hope is that we can have a more holistic understanding of where affordable housing lives, and also put as much pressure, energy, time into economic development that can serve people and produce more family wage jobs and living wage jobs for folks so that they can afford to live in the communities where they live.
Thank you.
And just to your question about coordination with jurisdictional partners, so this work is primarily focused on our affordable housing funding systems and the context, market and economic context that shape those funding structures. So we will be engaging through this work with our housing bond implementation partners, the 3 counties and the 4 cities who partner in implementing the affordable housing bond. But we're also working closely in coordination with the Planning, Development, and Research Center on all of the actions they've committed to in the Regional Housing Coordination Strategy, which include the Housing Accelerator Fund and some of that kind of technical assistance and other strategies to engage directly with cities around their housing production strategies. So this, we're presenting the bodies of work that the Housing Department will be leading this year, really focused on a foundation for future, funding for affordable housing investment, but that is in coordination with the broader work that our planning department is doing as well, and coordination with cities.
Thank you. A lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
I'll say.
Councillor Lewis?
Sure, thank you so much. I think that all of the strategy and research directions are spot on. I think in response to the question on the question slide about are there any particular populations we should be paying attention to, I think we've probably underestimated the amount of influence we can have on recommendations for building for folks with physical disabilities. And I want to make sure that we fully understand what levels of accessibility we have in our current stock that Metro has funded, that the general portfolio has funded, and the real costs of some of the quote unquote optional retrofits that don't actually work and that are actually quite costly. I know there's a couple of folks in my neighborhood who have to leave their motorized scooter outside their apartment because it can't go over like the little lip into their house. And it seems bonkers that they leave probably their most valuable asset just out in the rain. So, that's anecdotal, but there's a lot of need, I think, for us to get ahead on truly accessible units. In terms of the housing market and economic conditions, obviously our state has been a leader at advancing strategies for middle housing. I'm curious if in putting middle housing out there, the market has inadequately priced middle housing. Because I think we see a lot of cottage clusters that are not selling, and then I see the number or I hear the number and I roll my eyes. So I would wonder if we are gonna see a reaction and nobody wants to invest in middle housing because it's sitting vacant or it's sitting on the market for too long, when actually the price signals might be off for the product that they've put out there. So I don't know how much chasing on that we can do. And then finally, when it comes to innovative housing approaches, there's not that much that you can be innovative with housing. Like, there's a place that is safe for somebody to live and there is a door that locks. Like, those are the basics. But we seem to have always layered in some things as nice to haves, like efficiency in construction or air conditioning that maybe no longer need to be nice to have, then we should look for ways that those are no longer innovations or add-ons, but kind of become part of our core product. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
Councilor Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy President Wong. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for the work you're doing to build this assessment out. I'm in full support of it. I have a few questions really aimed around our assets here in the region. So, have we assessed the risk that affordable housing assets could be sold or transferred out of mission-driven ownership because of financial pressures? If not, should that be a part of this assessment?
I'm going to tee that up for Emily. Councilor Simpson, you and I were on a call the other day, and there's no other word to describe it other than urgent. There are community development corporations who are both worried about private equity buying up their properties, even though they're affordable housing covenants, as well as being concerned about their futures, the future of the organization themselves. There was one slide today titled Operational Stabilization, which has a very benign ring to it. But if there's an alarm bell associated with the phrase, it's operational stabilization right now. And I'm wondering, Emily, if you could dive a little deeper into the work that Melissa Arnold is leading in our department to speak directly to Councilor Simpson's concern there. Is that, unless you want to ask your other questions first.
No, please. I'll come back.
Yeah, that is exactly what that work is doing. And we, you have been reading about it in the papers for the past several months. Our affordable housing providers, and I know many of you know firsthand through organizations you're involved with, that our providers are really struggling. There have been some call to actions coming out from coalition partners. And we're really right now engaging with those partners to make sure we can bring the best and most robust understanding of what the needs are, that those are coordinated and organized, that we have a full catalog of the actions that are already underway at the state and local level. Here at Metro, where we've allocated, to the best of our ability, bond interest earnings to support stabilization of projects before they reach that fully operational point, but where we're starting to see that there could be challenges. So it's really about bringing all that information together. But to your question of, what are the most urgent risks, that is exactly a part of the work that Melissa Arnold is leading and will be coming back to the council in the fall. We hope to have some of that information gathered with partners. So
one of the things we really want to communicate directly about this is that during times where there's a whole industry that is really under existential threat, what you often see are individual components advocating for themselves. The work that Melissa is leading and others in our department is to congregate those folks, use Metro's superpower of convening, and turn that into action as a collective effort. So what regulatory changes do we need? What is the ask of philanthropy? Not just one foundation, but what is the ask of philanthropy? So my hope / expectation is that there will be a singular ask collectively, and Metro is playing that role to pull those folks together to do that.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Along that same line, what safeguards exist to ensure affordability is preserved if an owner experiences financial distress and seeks to exit the market? How do we make sure that we preserve those units as affordable?
Great question.
yeah, So for the, regulated affordable housing has regulatory agreements. All of our affordable housing bond properties have regulatory agreements that are long-term in nature and assure future affordability. There are a number of conversations happening right now about, are there elements of those agreements that could or should be relaxed to provide some regulatory relief while still maintaining affordability. So that is part of the work that needs to happen with funders. But there are, protections in place as well. And there are lessons learned from places like LA, which experienced kind of catastrophic, collapse of one of their major affordable housing providers. So we are going to be looking at lessons learned from other places as well, and hopefully ahead in our response as a region.
Thank you. I hope so too. I mean, it's a critical moment right now, and urgency is top of mind for not just the providers, but the people they serve. And so I know that we have to stop and study and look and see what's happening, but jet fuel, JPA, please put some in the tank.
Yep.
And
100%, Councilor Simpson. I completely agree with you. And as we're doing that, we got to do two things at once. We got to solve that urgent issue right now. And then also in the future, should we get to a point where council wants to refer something for future funding, the thing that we did with the bond was we made a bet that Portland and the Portland metro region was going to continue on the same trajectory, and it didn't for so many reasons that were out of our control. So what kind of flexibility and financial tools could be available to us so we can turn, not on a dime, but a little bit more flexibility than what we can right now? So we have to do two things at once, and we have to be capable of doing that. And we hear your advocacy, and it's a high priority for us right now.
absolutely. Thank you, Director Frost. Thank you, Emily.
Councilor Nolan?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the presentation and all the discussion that's happened so far. My comments and questions derive a little bit from some of the conversation that's already gone on. Liam, I particularly like the way you teed up the question of why is our housing inventory so unaffordable to people at the lowest income levels, and why are so many of our people at such low income levels that they can't afford housing? To me, that is a way of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, which while we actually are implementing measures approved by the voters, I think we need to continually step back and look at the big question. And that is, what is contributing to housing inaffordability at all levels, particularly at the lowest levels of income? And I want to know, we mentioned about Metro's superpower of convening. In addition to convening discussions around the financial viability of affordable housing developers, have you thought about playing a role in convening conversations about the financing aspects of housing construction, home ownership, the kinds of things? And also I'd include in that the monopolization of certain housing stock by investors, not local to Portland, not interested in the safety and progress of the Portland region, but just trying to skim off a little profit and then abandon town. Big question, and I'm sorry that it has gone on, but I think they're all tied together. Let's just start with conversations about the effects of financing choices of private lenders and private investors on the affordability of housing at subsidized levels as well as at median income levels. What can we do? What have you already started to do to get that to be a conversation in the region?
Yeah, so our work is primarily focused around the subsidized and regulated affordable housing inventory, both rental much of that being also funded through federal low-income housing tax credits, but also, the Affordable Housing Bond has 6 projects that are affordable homeownership in partnership with Proud Ground, our regional community land trust, so they will be permanently affordable to owners. So that's an area where we can learn from the lessons from the bond. But more broadly, I think that work of researching innovative models provides an opportunity for us to look more broadly beyond the LIHTC model. Most of the 2018 bond was invested, it wasn't limited to leveraging LIHTC, but our modeling and our goals all assumed that the majority of that portfolio would be leveraging those low-income housing tax credits, which create, the ability to leverage significant equity, but also, have specific limitations. And so we want to more broadly understand what the opportunities could be for alternative financing mechanisms. And to some extent, those relate to the broader market and economic environment that we're operating in locally. So in that way, there is an intersection with broader, understanding broader market-based factors. Our ability to influence those, I think, that is something that we will absolutely be looking for throughout this process. But I think it is, a bigger question. But understanding how we can be responsive, how we can be nimble, and anticipate that, the conditions that the market conditions that housing developers are operating in are much more dynamic than they were a decade ago. And so I think we want to think about structures and systems and delivery mechanisms that can be responsive to emerging opportunities and challenges.
I'll also add too, Councillor, that we're not interested in innovation for innovation's sake. We want to solve problems through innovation. And in our one-on-one briefings with each of you, you've probably heard me advocate around modular housing and how I believe that is going to be a big part of the housing construction economy in the next 10 years nationally. And one of the major challenges in scaling up modular housing is the financial tools, because you need a lot of upfront costs to be covered. And right now, the financial tools aren't there in a way that they are in perhaps Sweden, Scotland, and Japan. Those are the kind of things that we need to start studying and get ahead of if we really want to make a big bet on something like modular housing regionally and nationally. So to answer your question, Councillor Nolan, we are backed into being innovative. We have no choice but to do it. I for one, embrace it. So thank you for the support.
You're welcome. I understand, and Emily, it's appropriate for you to remind me that our focus has to be on the programs that the voters have asked us to fulfill in both building affordable housing and providing services to help people thrive in it. But because the local economy around housing and around other issues has changed since those measures were first considered, let alone approved, I don't want to spend time coming up with some whiz-bang idea that nobody wants to implement or nobody wants to live in. But our affordable housing bond measure will deliver about 5,000 housing units out of a housing inventory in the region of, I'm guessing, 600,000 units. I don't know the number, but the math would be pretty straightforward to do. Maybe 1 million units. My point being that subsidized housing is not going to make the broader issue of housing proportional to incomes in the region. Yeah. And I'm suggesting that Metro think bigger about what role we might play. Because while we want to serve the 10 or 12,000 people who will live in the affordable housing units that we catalyze, I have, and I know you all have as well, dozens of thousands of constituents who pay way more than 30 or 35% of their income to have decent housing. And that needs a champion. That needs a group of bold innovators and bold dreamers to address. And I'd like to see us step up to some of that.
Thank you, Councillor Nolan. Just very quickly, I feel really privileged and lucky that I get to work with Catherine Chiarlo at the Planning Department, and we share that same vision. And I know that Catherine's going to be presenting just after us today, so I won't steal any of her thunder, but I just want to reassure you that we absolutely share that same vision with you, Councillor Nolan. We're very lucky to have the Housing Department and the Planning Department under the same roof. And we're really excited about this council in particular, championing the work that we are putting in front of you and developing with you too. I should say that as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Move on to President Gonzalez.
Thanks, Deputy President. Appreciate you for running our meeting today. Staff, thank you for the presentation. I know that we've had a lot of work happening in the background too for the last few weeks on this issue. I'm happy with our roadmap. I'm happy with the strategy that we're taking, and I particularly like the qualitative and quantitative balance there. I think one of the things that I'm noticing is as we're trying to solve the problem, sometimes I see policies or suggestions that are not rooted in the realities of the numbers or of the experience of residents, and people kind of jump to conclusions. So I think the fact that we're prioritizing some of that work is really important. So I'm happy with all those things, but I do want to say something that I'm not happy with. I'm not happy when I open the Oregonian and I see that we still have 2,000 units of vacant affordable housing in the metro area. And I understand that there are, a lot of complicated pressures there, but I believe that the overwhelming the challenge that we're going to need to overcome is restoring trust and faith in voters, that the dollars that we spend and invest are highest and best use. So I want to ask you and your team, what are the steps that we're taking to address that kind of short-term issue that we are seeing, and how are we learning from that to inform this kind of policy development going forward for potential future revenue? So that's one question. And then second, I'm curious how, as we're looking through the policy of a potential housing bond and kind of capital resources to build things, how we're going to use some of these thought processes to also evaluate a deeper integration with, PSH or supportive services and things like that. Since when we passed the first bond, we had the idea of maybe doing something, but now we have two measures that will hopefully be together into the long run. What do you anticipate in terms of creating stronger efficiencies and confluence of investment there?
Great. Well, I can take the first question and then I'll pass it to Liam for the second. To the question about vacancies and short-term actions and how that informs long-term, that is all part of that operational stabilization work that we were that we've been talking about. It's as you alluded to, it is there are a range of factors impacting the vacancies. There doesn't appear to be a single driver. This is an issue that is particularly impacting Multnomah County, but also present in the rest of the region. And so we really want to understand better where those, our vacancies are being driven by market conditions, unit mix, affordability levels, different geographic context, and property-specific circumstances. And this assessment will help us understand that to inform the future. But there is also very immediate work happening to coordinate systems and understand where there are opportunities to respond. One example of that is the affordable housing bond interest earnings that have been deployed that have helped to bring the rent down on buildings that have not yet converted to their permanent financing, where rents maybe were planned at 60% and are being adjusted down to 45%. Which is really where we're seeing the greatest market demand. So there are actions underway. Metro has been supporting them. There is state funding support as well that has been deployed in the past year to address some of those, but there's more work needed. And that will be part of that coordinated operational stabilization strategy. And I think the most important thing to acknowledge is that it's a structural mismatch in that our affordable housing is not affordable enough. It is not a lack of demand for affordable housing, and so we really need to. That this at the heart of this is how do we create financing structures that can respond to what maybe hopefully is or a temporary market condition, but allow us to ensure that we are reaching the communities we want to serve. So I'll pass it to Liam to answer the second question about SHS integration.
And I want to double down on what you said at the end there, Emily. And it goes back to making a bet when you pass and develop a bond, because the development of affordable housing really is a bet at the conditions at the time. We're in a very different economic condition right now, and the vacancy issues that we're seeing are largely in income brackets of 30 to 60. 0 to 30, we believe, not fully occupied because there's always about a 6% vacancy rate, but the need at the 0 to 30 or poverty level is consistent. And so I just want to make sure that that is clearly an issue that is in the press right now to the fore. It's not about generally the bureaucratic process of placing people into housing. It really is about where our economy is right now. And I also want to give the regional bond development a pat on the back in the day in 2017 and 2018. We're on track for over 2,000 0 to 30 units, right, Emily? Yep. We wouldn't have that if it weren't for the bond. And those units will be serving folks continuously who are experiencing poverty. Moving on to the second question around the synergy between supportive housing services and affordable housing. We're on the other side of 5 years of implementation of both, so that gives us a lot of insight. So the colors are a little more nuanced, the contours are finer, and we have a better understanding. President Gonzalez, I'm really glad that you sent it in on permanent supportive housing, because that's where the two should be interacting. Internally at the Housing Department, we're already underway in trying to better understand the folks who need permanent supportive housing and where they would benefit from being placed into different programs. For example, we're talking right now internally around tenant-based versus project-based. For folks who are not aware, but tenant-based is placing folks into the private market and subsidizing their rents. And so they might be placed into a building wherein there isn't a building overall support for folks with specific needs, but project-based is an entire building that is affordable. So we're having those conversations. We have Yesenia Delgado in the chambers today. Paying attention to this. We have Emily Lieb coming to SHS work sessions too, as a demonstration to you all that we are making every attempt to integrate the SHS and the bond work. What that actually means is how we are going to do it in the future. It means how do we bring it to RPOC for discussion? How does the affordable housing assessment proceed and in contemplation of that? And I can tell you that having Emily and Yesenia at the helm of both, we're on track to be able to present something to council in the future, should the politics be there, that will have that synergy in place for the folks that we want to serve.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, affordability is the top issue for almost everyone in the region. And I think we are positioned to continue to lead in this space and provide actionable solutions that move us in that direction. And the success of the 2018 bond, I think, can't be overstated. And also, I think creating a narrative that explains the success of that, but then also there's a bigger portfolio that is older, different dynamics, different kind of properties that maybe weren't necessarily funded by the bond. But I think the voters just see affordable housing in general and kind of lump it all together. So again, I think top issue, people want us to work on it. I want to make sure that we have something actionable that people trust and feel that really that we're building progress in the region for the right reasons. And just to kind of reiterate, I think the work plan that we have, building off the success of what we've done, is essential. And for us to continue to also provide positive pressure to partners and operators and people with their portfolios to find solutions. So I appreciate that, and I'll give it back to Deputy President Wong.
Great. Thank you, President. Let's go back to Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question to ask. I was posed to me by somebody who is a single parent and candidate. I'm not even sure I can ask the question correctly, but I'm going to try. And the question really had to do is they said, well, what is appropriate in one area of our region, 30, 60%, and how we target the kinds of housing that we're looking for is not appropriate in some of the other areas of the region because of different wage levels, different housing cost levels, and so forth. And so I guess the question was, do we have the flexibility, or are we bound by HUD rules or so forth to create different patterns in different parts of the area depending upon the economic needs or the wage needs? Do we have that structure, or are we bound by state law and federal law to just do one SA?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question, and that is part of what that geographic assessment and also the market analysis work that we're doing is intended to support. We are not restricted with voter-approved funding. If the council were to establish, I think the council has the ability to establish priorities and geographic and allocation frameworks and investment strategies. And to define those as part of a framework. And there could absolutely be an opportunity to take a more place-based or geographic-based strategy to thinking about what are the kinds of investments that are needed in different places in the region. And I think, that through this assessment is to understand what do we have in place today? What are the variations in market conditions and needs in different neighborhoods and communities across the region, and how might that inform investment strategies?
Councilor Rosenthal, that is just a fantastic question. And for the majority of the history of this country, housing policy has been designed to segregate, to oppress people. And it is only in the last few decades that there's been an effort to advance the ability of people to thrive and to have access to economic opportunity. This has given me the opportunity to just say that over the next year, as we study the geographic location and siting of affordable housing, I want you to know that the Housing Department is taking it very, very seriously, because there are any number of academic studies that tell us that the concentration of poverty in different communities does not lead there. You've heard them all. What we have to also consider are the non-quantifiable sense of community support that people have. And so this is a really nuanced policy area. And I want to let you know that we have a person who in our housing department, Giovanni Bautista, who's leading this work for us right now and doing tremendous work. And we will be briefing you all on this. But that assumption, starting from the 1960s, is something that we really want to kick around and make sure that we're doing it right. And that means talking to people and hearing people's stories and understanding what's important to them, what's important to their families, as well as the academic studies as well. So back to President Gonzalez's point around the balance of quantitative and qualitative, that's exactly what we'll be doubling down on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure, thank you. I wasn't going to speak again, but I can't not speak. I think it's really imperative as we look at a next housing measure that we look for bond dollars to go to communities that don't yet have a bond project. And I will say very specifically, as a resident of Westland, as a longtime resident of Westland, Westland does not have a single unit of regulated affordable housing, and yet we have a Walmart, and yet we have a McDonald's, and yet we have 2 Chevron stations. People who work there, people who work there most likely qualify for regulated affordable housing. And the fact that they have no option to live in the same community where they work is something we should take seriously and address. So top tier for me would be making sure that we actually do have places in every single community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a couple of thoughts from me. I guess as you're doing the study and research, I'd really like to be thinking about how we can frame future potential bond measures or investments. And I think having gone through kind of the research in ways that could be reflected in a potential measure. So in parks, we have community visions, we've got protect and restore, and we've got all these different buckets. What would that look like in a housing bond where we can very clearly articulate the kinds of investments and impact that we're trying to make? I think many of the councilors talked about that today. I've also been thinking about lessons learned from the 2018 bond in terms of like opportunities lost. Like we made some bets, and then I know we have a very interesting land banking conversation going on right now, and I can't help but think what would be different if we had used the land banking dollars in 2018 for land banking instead of using that to develop more housing, which was a great choice in itself. But like, what would be different? Like if we still had revolving land banking dollars or something like that happening now. So I don't know if we can study that. Like we would have produced X number less units, but we'd have resources still at play now. I think that would be kind of a helpful analysis, because I think over time we probably would have produced more units, I'm guessing, but maybe not in the 8 years of the 2018 bond. I don't know. So that might be an interesting question. And I think just in terms of the buckets, like I think we all know the 0 to 30 family size units are the highest need, and I think that's a key role for the public sector to play in producing, because there's not really other financing mechanisms. So like, what would that tranche look like? And then what would, and I was gonna save this for Council Communications, but President Gonzalez and I, and Emily, you were there too, had a great meeting with OCF on their new middle income capitalization fund. And I'd be interested to think more about what the role of Metro and the public sector is in middle income housing, and also being able to leverage that together with other investments like that OCF is making in terms of like public-private partnerships. I think that's actually what voters actually want to hear about, is like, we're all in this together building housing, and Metro's going to do this and the philanthropy is going to do this, and we're actually going to think about how we can get more out of the sum of all our parts in terms of investment. That could be fascinating. So those are kind of 3 research buckets I'm hoping you can think about as you go in. It's like, what does leveraging public-private partnerships look like? What could some buckets be? And then what are the lessons learned from 2018 in terms of like, making resources last over time?
That's great.
Thank you, Deputy President Wong. The last point to me, I interpret that more of a philosophy and a lens with which we want to go about our work, which is putting the person first, or putting the family first, and how we want to serve them. So then what is our priority? What is our role? What is philanthropy's role? What is the economic development role? And it comes back to Councillor Nolan's point earlier around the more holistic view. We don't have the luxury of being able to have tunnel vision around homelessness and housing. We have to fulfill a role. Other people have to fulfill their roles in order to serve the person that we've all agreed upon is our priority. And we have to come to an agreement on that priority.
Yes, and I think that'd be great to be data informed around that. So if like, as we make decisions and honestly like place different kinds of bets. Like having the most data and lessons learned is going to be super valuable.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, thank you so much. Looking forward to the results of all your homework.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I see our guests are here, so we're going to move on to the next work session topic. What is good growth? Implications for growth management and economic development strategy. On Tuesday, Council received a presentation as part of our months-long series to bring more data and understanding to Council about our regional economy. Back in June, the first presentation we heard was about racial disparities in the Greater Portland region that affect prosperity and growth. We had a lot of hard questions, and they were all basically ask Mike when he's here. So today we have a special presentation for Mike Wilkerson, partner in Echo Northwest, that builds on what we learned back in June. So we're going to look forward to walking through all the data, but first I'll have our planning director, Catherine Ciarlo, introduce the topic and our speakers.
Thank you so much, Deputy President Wong and councilors. Thanks for having us here to talk today about our ongoing focus around shared prosperity for the region. I'm Catherine Ciarlo, Director of the Planning, Development, and Research Department. I use she, her pronouns. And with me today are Lorelei Juntunen and Mike Wilkerson from Eco Northwest. We are here as part of a series of council discussions about land use and our regional economy. You'll recognize this work plan graphic. This is what we brought to you as a work plan as a result of the Economic Development Resolution that you passed earlier this year. And I would say today's session lives somewhere between the orange and the green bars. The orange is the series that you all have been engaged in over the past few months, looking at legislative strategy development and issues. And the blue bar is our Job Ready Lands work, which we will bring back to you in the fall and give you an update on that. But this is really a conversation that is grounded in this council's values around growth. This is intended to be something a little bit different, to give you a chance to look at some data and really talk through and think through how that should shape Metro's actions moving forward. I think it is very well timed given the discussion we just had about the affordable housing strategy. Affordable housing and growth are obviously intrinsically linked, and we are excited to partner with the Housing Department as we figure out some of the economic implications for affordable housing and the affordability implications of the need for economic growth. So next slide, please. You all have seen this list as well. These are the legislative topics. You have seen 3 of them so far. That July 30th one in italics is today. We were really pleased to have Lorelei come on the 9th of June to talk about disparities, and we'll pick up some of that conversation where you all left off at that time. But we also wanted to bring back the presentation that Dr. Mike Wilkerson gave earlier this spring to the 1803 group. And he talked with them about some of the equity implications of growth as well. So we're bringing those 2 topics together and sharing with you some of the data both around our challenges and around our inequities. And if you remember Lorelei's presentation and the last pieces of your discussion on the 9th centered around the coordinated theory of change that Metro might have for economic growth, and that's where we're going to pick up today. And then just one more observation. The title of today's presentation is What is Good Growth? Unfortunately, our experts are not going to tell you that here today. Really, what we're trying to do is give an invitation for this council to start to look at that question in the context of data that will help inform those answers. What does good growth mean to this council at Metro at this time? I know you're all aware that growth has slowed dramatically in our region. We have talked about it a lot in recent months. Many of you have probably seen some of the information in the slides today. Some of it will be familiar, but it's important to keep that data front and center to help get everyone on the same page, both in the council, but also in our community, about why growth is slowing, and especially important, who is impacted the most by that slower growth. Without that knowledge, it's going to be hard to get to the policy solutions that actually advance shared prosperity. So again, the intent for today is for you all to truly engage with our experts. That said, Mike's presentation has 5 sections, and what we're going to ask is that that you hold your questions unless they're clarifying to the end of each section. And then the Deputy Council President, you can lead the Q&A during each of those moments. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Wilkerson and Lorelei Junton, and thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. Happy to be here again with you, councilors. For the record, Lorelei Junton, and I'm the president and CEO of Echo Northwest. I was here and overwhelmed you with a bunch of slides that showed you something that you probably already intuitively know, which is that there are still substantial disparities in economic outcomes by race and ethnicity and by gender. And actually, if we can pull up our slides, that would be helpful here. And in that presentation, we landed on, if you can hit the first slide, please, on these questions. Again, our goal for today is not to be able to answer these questions definitively, but to continue the conversation and use that conversation to really help to get to a good framing for the ongoing economic development work that Metro and regional partners are doing. The main takeaway from the previous presentation was essentially that in a moment when it's harder to find growth, we are also leaving a lot of talent on the sidelines. And how do we think about how we bring that talent into the fold and make sure that they have pathways to prosperity as well? And I think that's the right starting place for a conversation about good growth. It frames it in the context of equity and in the context of what equitable economic development might look like. So I guess I'd just ask you to hold these questions in your mind as you listen to what Mike is going to present. He's got the meat of the conversation, but I'm going to chime in just to help to provide some continuity, especially during Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to you. Have at it.
Thanks. So for the record, I'm Mike Wilkerson, Director of Economic Research at Echo Northwest. Next slide, please. So I think Catherine and Lorelei both mentioned shared prosperity and growth. And historically, when we've been talking about demographics and policy and economic development, it has centered, I would say, largely, maybe almost exclusively on jobs, sometimes framed as good jobs or family wage jobs, but that has largely been the extent of the conversation. And I think in the previous several decades, there was probably some relevancy to thinking about that given the growth trajectory that we were on. I think today the question that we're asking is that still the right question to be asking? And if it's not, or if there are some complementary data points we do want to think about more holistically as we think about what good growth is, like how would we approach that framework? So to begin with, I think many of you have probably seen some of this data in slides, but really just stepping through quickly the phase of demographic change that we are in and how layering federal policy has maybe accelerated some of those trends and what that means about growth in the future. So next slide, please. What I would say is here we can look at two things. On the left-hand side is a forecast from several years ago. And what that forecast showed was a slowing of population growth. So that trend had been underway. There was anticipated to be in this decade quite a big step back from what had been 7 or 8% growth to about 4% growth, and then 3%, et cetera, et cetera. What then happened essentially was layering in of federal policy on immigration and how that accelerated the timelines rather precipitously. And so if we look at a forecast from 2026, what we're seeing is in 2026, the projected growth nationally is about 0.3%. So if you took that over the decade, you'd be at 3%, and the trend only drops from there. And so really what it's suggesting is growth rates might be half as much as were even contemplated a couple of years ago. And that's not because of changes in demography, that's because of changes in policy. And so what that looks like effectively is nationally, the number of people being born versus dying every year has always been many millions more in the being born category. Starting in 2030, that will reverse and reasonably reverse forever. There are no documented cases anywhere in the world of once population natural change goes negative that has recovered. There are possibly policy interventions that can slow the rate of decline, but there are no documented cases of once you tip into that, how you can recover. The levers you have are really immigration at that point. And so the immigration policy is really the big change where historically we had seen 1 million to 1.5 million people a year more moving into the country than we're leaving. And in the most recent estimates, that number could be 500,000 or less. Some estimates have it at close to zero as the rate we are currently tracking. And so when you put those two things together, it is a big deviation from even what we had understood the future to look like a couple of years ago. Next slide, please. So if we take that through the lens of the metro region, and again here we're using the 3-county metro as a very close approximation of the metro region, we can see that trend in terms of what that has meant historically in the region of about 4,000 net new people trending kind of pre-pandemic, the big spike nationally happening during the Biden era, and then this precipitous drop. What we have a lot of uncertainty about is the extent to which that immigration will recover. And so we've kind of projected a scenario here of saying, well, if we use the most recent estimates from the Congressional Budget Office or Census Bureau, they think in 5 years we will return to kind of that historic norm. So that's what we've modeled in here. Natural change, again, you can see a decade or so ago, 10,000 more people were being born in the metro region every year than were dying, and that has been consistently declining to the point now where we're projecting, if current trends hold, 2028, 2029, that will go negative. As a state, we have been negative for 4 years. Multnomah County will be the first county of the 3 to go negative. That probably will happen next year. There were 200 people positive last year. The trend is dropping by several hundred a year, so that will probably go negative. And then really domestic migration is this big uncertainty. And historically, when the region has been growing its fastest, it's because of big upticks in domestic migration. For the last 5 years, domestic migration in the region has been negative. It is recovering. The extent to which it recovers is still a projection. So if we just kind of assume the same trend, we might get back to neutral in 4 or 5 years. Unclear what that recovery will look like then. But I think it's helpful to just understand, if we look at the individual components, the things that we have some ability to control at the regional level are really only domestic migration, and that largely domestic migration as a lever is likely to be much less than it has been in the past. Next slide, please. So if we put that all together, what we're effectively able to do is say, what could growth in the region look like going forward? And statewide, the current growth estimates are between 0.4 and 0.5% a year. I know Metro maintains their own forecast, but I think it's helpful to just understand that those scenarios I just pointed to have us at maybe half of that, 0.25, 0.3% a year of what that growth looks like going forward. And again, the major uncertainty is around international immigration, and the lever that we have some ability to control is domestic migration. Next slide, please. I think if we look at, let's say, recent comments from the City of Portland chief economist, he has said effectively the cities have been in a recession for the last 3 years. And he looks at population, which we just talked about, housing affordability, and jobs as kind of those three main levers. And housing affordability, and I know the previous panel has talked a lot about this, our intention is to not get into this in a meaningful way, but I think the point is when we think about housing affordability, there's really kind of three contributing factors. It's how much housing are you producing, knowing that as you produce more, the market conditions can change and it can relieve price pressure. It's how much does it cost as an input, so are there regulatory, permitting, efficiency, scale, other things that inform the cost side, and then it's the income. And what we have spent the least time talking on is the income as a lever to get back into housing affordability balance. But if we just look at relative to the US, we have kind of stabilized here in a region, and our affordability relative to the US is more affordable than Seattle. However, in Seattle, their incomes are a lot higher. And so when we've tried to make adjustments in Seattle, it's possible that overall affordability could be greater in Seattle because their incomes are closer to the costs and the rents than we see in our region. Next slide, please. On the jobs front, I think this is the one that if you live in the moment, it's hard to fully grasp how quickly this has changed. And so every month, BLS puts out the national job change, and then that gets subsequently revised. And coming out of the pandemic, we were seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs being added a month. And if you look at the average in 2022, that was 377,000 jobs a month. Pushing forward a year into 2023, that dropped to 217,000, pushing forward 120,000, and then last year was about 15,000 jobs. We are seeing now huge monthly variation. I think the key is from the federal perspective, it's a survey-informed estimate that gets revised, and their stated margin of error is 100,000 jobs. So what that effectively means is if you have 50,000 jobs as the print, you can't say if that's zero or actually did you lose 50,000 or did you gain. And so what that I think means is a reliable indicator that we've historically had to kind of give us directionality as to what's happening because of the slowing amount of job growth and the investment in accuracy. We don't really have that indicator anymore. And all of our state and other estimates kind of flow off of these national models. And so effectively, looking at jobs as a real-time indicator, I think is going to be very challenging in the next, well, many years and potentially for the long run. If we look at the next slide, I think this really validates from an economic standpoint, next slide please, how we can think about that. And so the concept is break-even employment. And this is like probably the wonkiest thing I'm gonna say today, so bear with me. Break-even employment is a model that effectively says, how do we keep the job balance the same on a month-to-month basis, given demographics, labor force participation, how many jobs do we need to add to basically keep the market stable? And again, coming out of the pandemic, that number rose to close to 300,000 jobs a month. And again, this is nationally. What has happened since is effectively that number has dropped to near zero based upon, this is the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas's estimate. They push this out every 6 months or so. And so whether it's zero or positive 10,000 or positive 50,000, I think the big takeaway here is when you're a region and you're trying to think about adding jobs, regions that are adding jobs reasonably means another region is losing jobs because of the demographic trends we're facing in the current economic climate. This is unprecedented in US history. There's never been a year where the population has dropped, and there has never been a time where our jobs have been essentially flat, as maintaining our unemployment rate is probably an easy way to think about that. And so all of our historic reference points around we should be growing, we should be growing, we should be managing growth are at a very different point now than we've ever been before. And could this change? Yeah, it could, but I think this is the likely trajectory that we're looking at for the near term, certainly. The last thing I will say is, and I had a slide on this and we cut it, but I think it's a point worth making. We probably cut 50 slides in the interest of time. Jobs and population are not going to be increasing based on the current trajectories and trends. However, there has been a decoupling between the number of people in a household and population over the last 5 years, and that's expected to grow. And so put differently, average household size is going to grow. And so even in a time, average household size is going to decrease. The number of households, I was at council this morning talking about trailblazers, and my head is still trying to unwind from that one. The average household size will continue to decline. And so even if our population isn't growing, the number of households will grow. And households being the unit of demand for housing, I think is an important contextualization to understand. Population not growing doesn't mean that we're not growing the demand for housing into the future. Okay, I think that's the last slide for this section. So let me pause here to see if there are any questions, technical or otherwise.
Yeah, I'll just add, if I can ask one question. In projecting the international immigration, you went back to historical averages. Did you do one based upon the policies of the current government, which are quite anti-immigration? In other words, how things would look if those policies were continued?
Yeah, Councilor, that's a great question. I think I relied upon the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, and Census's estimates of that, which have been updated in the current policy environment. And so those two institutions believe immigration will slowly recover. But I think it's a fair point to say, if we look at the current number of annual trend, that number could be approaching zero, and that policy could maintain that number for a number of years. So that's, again, very much uncertain.
Okay. Let's go with President Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you both so much for joining us today and continuing to help us build our understanding of a macro picture of what's happening in Oregon and in our country. So I hear you said a really powerful statement, Mike, about how at no other point in our country's history have we kind of experienced a downward trajectory both in terms of jobs and kind of like population growth, which is interesting. And I'm curious, like, in the best case scenario for artificial intelligence and AI, does that help us kind of change our like general productivity or general quality of life by introducing innovation or technology, or basically my underlying question is that what's our thesis then for good growth going forward in a time where some of these underlying variables may not continue, and does technology play a role in that? And if yes, what kind of policy should our local governments be thinking about to kind of try and nurture best possible outcome?
The next 4 sections try to unpack that, hopefully in a way that logically makes sense. But that is I think, big takeaway question here. And so we're going to try to provide some data to help provide, some frameworks on how we can think about that and some indicators that might be helpful in that process. But productivity, absolutely, I think, is going to be very important going forward. And we have many slides and discussion points about that.
All right, thanks. I was sorry for jumping the gun on that. Okay, great. Thank you.
Let's keep questions to clarifying on this segment, and then we'll have big picture questions at the end. But let's go, Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. I'm just kind of curious about an economic assumption that you make around job to person ratio. I think last time we had this discussion with you, Lorelei, we talked about gig economy. But I think even outside gig economy, there is just more normalization of a person holding multiple jobs. And I'm worried that maybe some of the fuzziness around job creation is just more people having multiple jobs and still the same number of people who are left out of the economy, and how those historical trends are accounted for or maybe not. If you have any thoughts on.
One data point I can maybe bring and send over later is, in Oregon, our labor force participation rate is different, and part of the reason for that is when you look at our part-time workforce, it is larger than almost any other state. And so that is part-time, but also potentially people with multiple jobs. And so really when you're thinking about full-time, full-year employment, that's a limited worldview of where we stand today. And I think going forward, likely part-time or multiple part-time jobs is going to be more important. So I think, bringing in that additional contextualization in addition to just job creation through the lens of full-time jobs, particularly in Oregon with where we stand, I think is an important thing to track as well.
Had never heard we were leading on that. Thank you.
Counselor Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy President Wong. 2 questions real quick. What are our levers to return Portland to positive growth? Or is that in subsequent sections?
In terms of population, if you can go back a couple of slides, we are growing today as of the last data we had because of international immigration.
One more back.
So I think the challenge is really the uncertainty around. So if you look at that last year, one more slide, please, forward. 2025 is positive. But if you look at the dark green bar on top, that is international immigration. And so if that number shrinks, as it's projected to do in the forecast, we might get to near zero. And if immigration goes down even more, we could plausibly be negative in this next 12-month period.
Thank you for that. And this is more so for you, Catherine. If our long-range plans have led us to this point and we're analyzing what policies that we as the long-range planning body are doing, are we responsible for that growth going to Austin and Nashville and not staying here?
Thank you for that question, Councilor Simpson. I think the way I would answer that is similar to the way one of our panelists in the 2040 growth concept look back answered that question about the growth concept and asked, did the growth concept result in this case, the question was about housing, higher housing costs, problems with housing affordability and availability. And the answer that actually a couple of our panelists gave there really caught my attention, which was our long-term planning itself didn't cause the situation, but our long-term planning also didn't anticipate the possibility of that occurring. And so I think the way I would answer what you're saying now is our long-term planning didn't cause this situation, but it is critical that as we continue moving forward with long-term planning, we recognize where we are and recognize that we need to take intentional steps to keep this from happening. And also to keep the disparities that we're going to hear more about today from continuing forward as well. Does that get to your question?
I think it does.
Okay, thank you.
You can't plan for everything, obviously. Nobody knew Donald Trump, whatever, right? So part of that, I think, is a little bit about our weakness as an agency. We're humans. We can only project so far. And so I do want us, as we continue to design a future, that we keep things in mind.
Thank you. I totally agree with that. And I think the long-term planning team couldn't agree more as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine.
Counselor Nolan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Returning in a slightly different way to how you're defining jobs, does your projection, does your model treat a job of a brain surgeon at OHSU as one job, just like a janitor at OHSU is one job? And assuming the answer is yes, how do we take that information and apply it to policy? Because we want to make sure that everyone in the region has a family wage job.
Counselor, great question. I think I'd say let's pause and revisit, because the next several sections, I think, are going to provide some context around the question, which is absolutely a job is not a job is not a job. The type of job, the type of educational credentials that are required historically for that job. Wages, absolutely. All of those things absolutely matter. And I think that is a more comprehensive lens versus historically what has just been counting jobs. So let's say,
So we're getting to that in a little bit.
we will
right.
get to that as, we believe we're covering that, but we will look forward to your questions in terms of, did we adequately provide enough context?
So that we
Well done.
we don't bury the headline here. The whole point of this presentation is that you need to look at the next level down of nuance on when you are thinking about jobs and how that relates to economic development, or you're never going to be able to get to a concept of good growth that accounts for the equitable outcomes that I know that we all care about.
Exactly.
So, yeah, to date in the presentation, we've just been showing sort of straight top line numbers of jobs, but we'll dig into it in more detail now.
Thank you.
Let's move on.
All right, let's
do it.
jump to the next section. So a couple slides forward. Here we go. Okay, so as we just said, how should we be thinking about growth if it's not population and jobs? So next slide, please. I think the starting place of a framework, to the extent that it has been contemplated historically, is really GDP, so gross domestic product. And really it's understanding that GDP is the combination of two things. It's population and productivity. And so in any year, you can look at GDP growth or the few years where we've had decline and say, how much of our growth has been because of adding more people, more jobs, and how much of that are truly productivity gains? And I think that lens is important because in the past, we've had meaningful contributions from population growth. But if in the future we're not getting population growth, what that means is really we're looking at productivity, and productivity through a lens, typically can be thought of the amount of GDP per worker. So if you're holding workers constant and GDP is going up, that is a productivity gain. So if we go to the next slide, if we look at our region today, so this is just this point in time, the most recent data we have, and we look at the top 50 metros in the US, the median GDP per worker, or a measure of productivity, is about 82,000. We sit at roughly 10,000 below that. So if you look at, where we are ranked, we're 41st of the top 50 metros. We're trailing the median by about 13%. And you can see there are some big outliers at the high end in terms of the Bay Area, certainly. Boston, DC, Seattle are the other top 5 metros. And so this is where we sit today. If we go to the next slide, I think the question is, is GDP alone sufficient? And founder of Echo Northwest, Ed Whitelaw, has been contemplating these things for a while. We have at Echo Northwest. These are not new ideas. I think the challenge is, in a time of ample growth, we maybe lost track of key questions around distributions of income and understanding that growth that's benefiting a few at the expense of many through a lens of GDP only counts as growth. And in the estimation of Dr. Whitelaw, that is a fundamental flaw. So if we go to the next slide, here we can really look at 2 cycles starting in 2012. So coming out of the global financial crisis, Portland started at the very bottom. So in the first year of recovery from 2012 to 2013, if you look at the top 50 metros, Portland's productivity, so that's GDP per worker, grew the least of any of the top 50 metros. So we started very, very slowly. But over the course of the next several years, coming out of the global financial crisis, we grew to as high as 28th ranked. And so again, starting at 28th and starting at 50th and growing to 28th, no economy grew faster than Portland during this period other than Boston. And so we transformed the region from very much a low productivity region to a relatively high productivity region from the years of 2012 to 2019. So if we pause and we look at that period of time, we can look at what happened distributionally during that time. So if we go to the next slide, what we're looking at here is the income distribution relative to the US. And so 100% is equal to the US. On the left-hand side is the lowest earning households. On the right-hand side are the highest earning households. And what you'll see is 2 things. One, the slope is negative. And so what that means is our lowest earning households earn more than the US, but that premium decreases up until historically around the 75th percentile. The key takeaway as it relates to that decade of transformational growth in the region is the entire curve moved upwards. And so that meant that growth benefited relatively everyone. Does that mean we don't have housing affordability challenges? This is nothing to do with affordability in the region. This is just purely the income side of the equation. And I think we spent a lot of time talking about affordability. Here, I think the important framing is let's look at specifically what's happened distributionally. And during that period of growth, we saw broad-based benefits. If we go to the next slide, the second period of time is really starting in the year prior to COVID and then the last many years. And what you'll see is that trend entirely reversed. And so if we now take the cumulative change from our region, starting in 2012 to the last year of data we have 2024, we dropped back down again to 42nd. And so, yes, cumulatively over that period, we did see gain, but really that gain is 2 periods of time, rapid increase followed by rapid decline. So if we look at the next slide, what we can then say is what happened to the income distribution during that 5-year period? And what happened was effectively that gap of the darkest red lines, the second red line is the change. And the change was our lowest earning households all lost ground up until about the 35th percentile. So our lowest earning households relative to the US all fell behind, and everywhere up had no change. And so you see a very distinct pattern of strong productivity gains flowing through to the entirety of the income distribution. But when growth stalled, it was entirely absorbed from the income perspective by the lowest earning households, while the middle and high income households were relatively unchanged compared to the US average. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, that was a quick hitting section, I think, to introduce just the concept of growth relative to productivity. And now we really want to move into this next question of, okay, if we're looking at GDP growth, how does that benefit people in the economy? But let's pause and see if there are specific questions about those last few slides.
Let's move.
Great. So now the question is, what's the linkage? So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of think about a cycle. And that cycle ideally is virtuous in the sense of it's producing broad-based benefits, shared prosperity, et cetera. And so if we start at the top with GDP growth, really what we want to focus in on is the productivity gains portion of that. Traded sector investment, we talk a lot about as a strategy. And what traded sector investment is just bringing in outside dollars, and that can be a vehicle for growth alone. But productivity gains is the thing we can control much more so in our region, right? We can't control the amount of investment directly coming into our region. We can control the attractiveness of an investment environment, so that's an important consideration. The key concept I think we want to introduce is productivity gains. The channel through which it benefits individuals is what we call labor share. And so labor share is the share of GDP that is going to labor. And the thing we care about is not the cumulative amount of how much is going to labor. We want to understand the distributional effects. And so when we look at those two periods historically, we can see again the distributional effects of a period of growth, of shared prosperity versus a period of low growth and what the implications were. What that virtuous cycle looks like is if productivity is growing and labor share is holding constant or potentially growing and the distributional effects are there, that generates local demand. And that local demand then perpetuates that cycle. And so we can control our cycle of economic growth without necessarily being reliant on outside investment. Outside investment absolutely helps, but I think the lens that we've historically focused on is it's just the traded sector. We should only focus on the traded sector, and traded sector is the only way we're going to get to a path to prosperity. And I think this reframing is another way of an example of how you can create a virtuous cycle that is not solely reliant on external investments from out of the region. So we're going to unpack labor share. What labor share means, next slide please, is two things. One, you can think about it as compensation, or you can think about it as wages and salary. But the top line number is compensation. And so what that means is for every dollar of GDP, if we look at the 1970s peak, about 58 cents of that $1 went to wages and compensation. Since 1970, that has been consistently eroding to where today that number is about 51%. If we look at wages, that gap relative to compensation has widened. And so what that effectively means is the benefits have increasingly taken a larger share of labor. Mostly my presumption is that is through the cost of medical insurance, not necessarily through increased worker benefits related to retirement or otherwise, but it's the bundle of all of those things. But again, you can see the gap today between wages and salary is about 42% or 42 cents of every dollar of GDP nationally go to wages and salary, 51 cents go to total comp. And again, the trend is very, very clear. This is as low as it's ever been, and that this has been a 40-year trend in developing. So given that backdrop, I think the question is, how do we react to that? Councilor Simpson, you had a question?
I'm just looking at this. This is incredible that we were able to see this for 40 years and we didn't account for it. We didn't plan for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, please. What I think is largely been unknown and unstudied is the extent to which that varies across states. The national data has been out there in headlines in the public realm, but generally speaking, we've seen little to no investigations of how that distributionally looks at by state, and we can track this over time. Oregon is the largest state. Put differently, no state captures a larger share of its productivity in compensation than Oregon. I think that is, on the face, very surprising to most people.
I could see on their faces that it was surprising to them.
So I think really what we want to unpack is several things, like how long has that been the case? Is that sustainable, and how, and like what does that implication mean for the future? And here, in the interest of time, we do a surface level unpacking. There's a lot more depth here, but I think in the interest of just starting this conversation, we want to start the big picture, and we can drill down to the extent that we think will be helpful. So if we go to the next slide, I think the question about how recent of a phenomenon is this is relevant. Has this always been the case? And the answer is it hasn't always been the case. Oregon has consistently been in the top 10 states. So if you go back to around 2000, you can see we hovered around, let's say, 5th and 20th. But starting in 2018, we had a consistent rise in our rankings. And in the last 3 years of data, 23, 24, 25, Oregon has now been number 1. And really, this is, I think, puzzling to many people on the face of it. Oh, how could that be? Why is that the case? So really, I think we got to unpack the components of how labor share transpires, and there's 2 components. So if we go to the next slide.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. Quick clarifying question.
Yep, absolutely, go ahead.
On that last slide, this is compensation. Does this treat compensation the same as we discussed earlier, as in $5 million package for a downtown attorney fits in with how much of that goes home with that person as compared with a line worker? Or is there any differentiation between stock earnings and things like that? Is this just wages, or is it total compensation?
Great question, Counselor. This is total compensation. So I think, again, we'll start to unpack more around the industry, the wages, the occupation, because those things are very relevant questions. But the data that we have that's generally available for this is best at looking at compensation. It's challenging to get at necessarily some of those other nuances. So let's keep going, but I think that is framing to understand, yes, this is total comp, not wages. Next slide. So when we're talking about labor share and how it changes over time, there are 2 mechanisms through which that can happen. The first is structural, and this is the dominant, it's 80 to 90% of change over time comes through structure. And this is the workers' share within an industry. And so as an example, if we look at labor share, falling historically in manufacturing, retail, et cetera. That's one of those driving factors behind why nationally we see structural declines in labor share. The other is composition, and so that is the mix of your industries. And so if, for example, some industries are growing faster and they're low labor share industries, that can also be a reason why. Conversely, if high labor share industries are growing as a share of the economy, that can translate into the overall component. And again, both of these things vary across states. So I think what we can do is start to look at what contributes most to Oregon's #1 rank in this, and it's the structural component. So if we go to the next slide, on average, Oregon is 4 to 5 percentage points higher than the US as it relates to the structure, but it's not consistent across industries. And so if we look at the industries with the green bars, those are the industries in which workers in that industry in Oregon are receiving a higher share of compensation than the national average, and the red bars are lower. And so if we look at, for example, retail trade as an example, there you could say, okay, the fact that we have a minimum wage structure that we do, and minimum wage as a share of retail is relatively high, that can drive why our labor share is higher in retail than in other industries. Manufacturing, government, et cetera, are the driving factors of that. But we do have industries where workers are earning less of a share of that than they do on a national trend. Next slide, please.
Just a technical question on that one. Go back to that slide. Under what category would high tech come under? Professional technical, or I assume, right?
High tech is a challenging industry to think about because it lives in a bunch of different NAICS codes, is how the government characterizes these. And so in Oregon, high tech is largely in manufacturing. You also have high tech in finance and insurance, weirdly. That's where a lot of the software and other tech firms are, and then some in professional technical. And then information is relatively small in Oregon, but manufacturing is where a large portion of our high tech lives.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously have questions of research, construction, manufacturing, and then data centers, which are big issues here, and dominate the Oregon market more than they do any other state, really. So that's an interesting separate, shall we say, distribution of where they lie. Thank you.
So I think for us, again, we can think about the compositional effects of the economy. And so we do have some compositional benefits. For example, our manufacturing sector, manufacturing, like that compounding effect is a benefit through the lens of this labor share concept.
Okay, thanks. Councilor Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy President Wong. Real quick question on this last. I'm assuming this is more mining than oil and gas, or oil and gas production we done turned into Texas. What's happening?
Yeah, we always hesitate to put mining and gas and oil, particularly in the lens of the metro versus the state. I think we think of it as a relatively small industry as an outlier. So I think focusing on it is not necessarily driving the result of Oregon in its highest ranking.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions about this section? Okay, let's jump into education and workforce training. I think understanding historically how workforce training and education through the context of our economy has resulted in outcomes is important to then layer in the question Council President Gonzalez started off with, which is in this time of disruption and uncertainty largely related to AI, how much of what we have seen historically is likely to predict future outcomes, or is everything going to be different? And through a lens of a more comprehensive look at shared prosperity, do we have some insights that we can look at from a policy perspective? So if we go to the next slide, I think just starting with understanding race and ethnicity and educational outcomes, we can look at the last decade. And what we see is, and this is in constant dollars, every single category of race, ethnicity within a bucket of educational attainment saw gains. And this is at the median. And so, for example, if you look at high school degree, white, Black, Asian, Hispanic households, the median household all in real terms gained. Same thing with some college and same thing with bachelor's degrees or higher. And so at a high level, we could step back and say, okay, we see this. There's an intentional strategy around education and understanding that our workforce is growing and that gain is continuing to reinforce over time through the last decade of economic change. If we dive a little deeper though, go to the next slide. There's always one chart where you're like, did you have to include that? That's hurting my head. This is the one. It could probably be,
This is the one? No.
could be 5 charts, but let's try to, I think, synthesize the takeaway here is focusing alone on the median oftentimes can mask distributional effects. And so while yes, it is true, the median in every instance is going up, the median is 1 point on a distribution, that's one person. And so around the median matters, but if we go out a little bit to the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, we can start to understand are higher earning workers seeing the same benefit or are lower earning workers seeing the same benefit, or is this really concentrated in the median? And what we see is if we look starting with Black workers, what we see is at the high school degree level, in real terms, constant dollars, the 25th percentile is earning less today than it did a decade ago. The median increased by 19%, but the 25th percentile dropped by 14%. And the 75th percentile grew. And so if we think about distributionally, high school degrees, the largest share of benefits is actually accruing at the high end in terms of the workforce, not necessarily in the median. Conversely, if we look at bachelor's degree for Black workers, the 75th percentile today earns 1% less than they did a decade ago. And so there the gains are accruing more to the middle and a little bit to the low end of the distribution. And so I think when we start to understand historically the gains to education we can see are clear. Within race and ethnicity and within educational attainment, that's not a consistent trend that we can lean into and understand. We have to really start to think about through the lens of the types of jobs. So if you have a bachelor's degree and you're in our high value add compensated firms, what does that look like by race and ethnicity? And how can AI and other productivity adjustments? These are all the big questions I think we're trying to start to illuminate with some data. For Hispanic households, the trend looks more consistent, but what you see is the low end growth is effectively the highest in every bucket of educational attainment. And so while the median is growing, the 25th percentile is growing faster than the median and the 75th percentile is growing slower. So again, trying to understand the combination of race, ethnicity, educational attainment, and then wage distribution, I think is an important lens as we start thinking about employment opportunities. Yeah.
Mike, at this council, we've talked a lot about like construction careers and construction jobs. Is that accounting for, when you're talking about educational attainment, whether someone's, a journeyman or gone through an apprenticeship? Because I think what we're seeing is those kinds of jobs are typically living wage, but I'm not sure how that shows up here.
So the challenge is, particularly in a place like Portland, if we try to understand race, ethnicity, educational attainment, and industry, we don't have enough data to give us that really comprehensive picture. So we kind of look at it at 2 of the 3 at a time. But I think the intuition is right, yes, within construction, certainly for skilled apprentices and journeymen, they're going to be at or above the median, and you can see what that looks like there. But trying to layer in an industry lens on top of education and on top of race starts to get into challenges in terms of data reliability.
Okay. Councilor Rosenthal.
A question of significance, looking at this chart, as you say, it's a little hard to unpack everything. But I notice in the high school degrees for most of them have the range changes, but they're more or less the same range. But for that one high school degree for Black NH, the range is much broader. Is that a significant change? In other words, the range of jobs, of employee wages or compensation is much broader compared to all the others. Is that significant?
Counselor, good question. Significant through our world means a very specific thing. We would say like statistically significant. And so what I would say is the Black population with high school degree counts aren't large enough to say that that is a statistically significant change.
Oh, okay.
It's observed in the sample. I think you'd want to look at that over many different, these are 5-year samples, many different 5-year samples to try to understand that. But we can't say with a degree of certainty that it's statistically significant. But if that were real, then that is a meaningful change that you don't see in the other matrices.
That was my question, because if it was statistically significant, then one looks for some explanation. If it's not, then you have to look for more data.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Council President Wong.
Oh, please.
Can I ask, with the Black population being, 2% of the state, 9% of the region, why is it so hard to capture data?
So this is using the PUMS sample, and so it's a 1% sample of the population. And so when you're sampling 1%, and we call it a crosstab, it's race and ethnicity by education, by income, by industry. You just get at counts of being really low.
I'm hitting that is we are a sample by the entire population. Why are we singling out 1% when we should be looking at the entire 2%?
Yeah, I think that's really a good insight, which is to say we see things that we think are helpful here. Can we dive deeper by doing more research in our community to understand the extent to which, and this seems like a really rich opportunity to say, yes, like at a low level of effort, can we learn more because it looks like there's something going on here?
Right. Again, 9% here, 2% of the state, that should be that's your sample.
Yeah.
That entire population. Yeah.
I think we were taking questions along the way, but I think we're still mid-section here, so happy to take more questions or we can continue on.
Let's move on.
So this next slide really, if we jump ahead, builds upon this notion of the premium to educational attainment. And so what we're looking at is the median earner with a bachelor's degree versus the median earner with a high school degree. And so that ratio, let's say for white households, in 2023 was 2.37. If we go back in time a decade earlier, it was 2.28. And so what that means is the returns to education for white households are growing over time. The ratio is growing. If you had a bachelor's degree in 2014, the median worker would have earned 2.28 times more. Now it's 2.37 times more. And so this isn't a question about are the returns to education. It's a question about are those returns amplifying or are they stalling or are we losing ground? And in the case of white households, they're kind of stalled. In the case of Asian households, they are amplifying. So the ratio grew from 2.94 to 3.5. In the case of Black households and Hispanic households, the returns are declining. Are they statistically significant as a measure of decline? No. So I can't say definitively if it's a stall or it's a decline. But if we look at the ratio for Hispanic households, it was 2-to-1, now it's 1.94. So again, these are big questions around, are we seeing momentum in this as a strategy, or as the economy is changing, do we anticipate this trend to accelerate with productivity, AI, et cetera? Is a strategy leveraging educational attainment likely to be as effective going forward? I think is a key question. Next slide, please. Okay, that was the end of the section. Let's move on.
I just want to layer in from the presentation that I shared in June, the concept of occupational sorting, and make sure we don't forget about that as part of Mike was bringing new information about how education results in differences in outcomes and what kind of return you get from that. But with changes in occupation, we do see large shifts in wages. And because we have a concentration of workers of color in low-wage occupations and industries, I think that might be part of what's driving the numbers that we were seeing in that last slide. So just as we're moving into a conversation about how it informs economic development strategy, let's not forget about that piece of it as well.
Councilor Lewis.
Yeah, I know from an economic perspective, you're looking at degree attainment, but I feel like in this exact moment in time with the recent announcements from PSU, it would behoove us to really also recognize that educational experience matters. It's not just the degree itself. And if we are going to continue to rely on Portland State University to be the major educator for our region at that level, we're going to need more partnership and understanding the direction they're going and why they're letting go of liberal arts and sciences while maintaining other programs. Just a hot take.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Just a question, something that worries me a little bit. You had the chart that showed the rapid change in Oregon's economic perspective, and then a plateau, and then a sharp decline. And I'm wondering if that is related to, in any sense, the relatively sharp decline we've seen in Oregon's educational performance and ranking.
I haven't run that as a statistical measure. I mean, my guess is no, that's not the educational, that the trends in education maybe are kind of correlated to that, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that the feedback effect of educational attainment we typically measure in fourth graders, et cetera, working its way through wouldn't necessarily be directly tied to our educational performance. But in the long run, there are, I'm sure, some feedback effects there. Okay, so then the question becomes, I think, we started to unpack these topics. There's a lot more there that we can look into. How does this inform economic development strategy? And so if we go to the next slide, the answer is in many ways. I think economic development typically focuses on two main theories of change. Lorelei can step in here too, but this notion of gardening, so growing what you have within your region versus recruitment of trying to bring in, and there's layers of nuance in there, but broadly speaking, I think if we look at this moment in time in demography, these next 5 years are crucial, because if we think about replacement of retiring workers, you can just see what that wave rapidly coming and then dissipating looks like. And so through a lens of opportunity of understanding all the things we've been talking about today, industry, occupation, wage, that there is this, let's say, never seen before concentration of large numbers of people retiring, and then those opportunities within industry or for retraining are here today. And understanding that that's not the same magnitude in every industry. Education and healthcare is at the top end of that, whereas something like leisure and hospitality isn't really seeing that same. It's more demographically balanced, but understanding that it varies by industry and that is happening in the next several years and then dissipating in the next decade is really helpful context if we're thinking about what are those opportunities. This is one of those ways where that opportunity is going to play out with near certainty and something we can react to from a policy perspective. Next slide, please. This one is more around understanding a scenario. And the scenario I think we've started to understand is we're likely to see GDP growing faster than population over the next several years. The extent to which GDP grows could be all over the place. But if we just look at general projections, GDP might be growing at 2.5% a year. Population might be growing at 0.5% a year. So then the question becomes, through a lens of labor share, what does that mean? And what that means effectively is if we maintain our labor share in Oregon at 56%, that the compensation per worker in Oregon would grow. And the opportunity set is, if we focus in on labor share, that seemingly small changes in labor share can translate, to broad opportunity as it relates to incomes. And so if Oregon increased its labor share to 60%, the average wage would grow to 108,000 or 6,000 more. But conversely, if you erode labor share, it very quickly also erodes. And so this is thinking about, through this particular lens in time of GDP growing faster than population, we can really understand this as a prosperity dividend of sorts that is potentially coming, and that's different than we've seen in other moments in time in our economic cycles. I think that's the last slide, and happy to open up now to either specific questions on these two or more broader reflections.
Great, thank you. Colleagues. Start with Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Could you put that last slide up? That kind of summarizes some of the thoughts I've been having. And obviously, we want to move toward the green line. What are the tactics that metropolitan areas use to achieve a higher labor share of total prosperity?
I would say that's challenging because typically I haven't seen any level of government from a strategy perspective identify this as a strategy and have tactics. But if we abstract away from that a little bit in the moment, I think historically we focused on, let's say, cluster strategies. And so a cluster strategy is really thinking about two things. It's changing the mix of industries, and it's understanding within that cluster what are the characteristics of the firms that also vary. Because in Oregon, we can see, a large part of our advantage is from the fact that some of our sectors have higher than average labor shares. And then some of it is because our industry mix also is good. And so if you're thinking about it, I think those are really the two big levers to think about. And then obviously there's lots of nuance and minutia that stem from that. But really it's, are we trying to improve our within industry performance, or are we trying to change the mix of our industries?
Well, and if I might follow up, that should inform, and we have lots of time in our plans to discuss this, but I think it's a key factor that can inform the types of priority industries we want to grow in our own garden, as you say, or recruit from out of state, and understanding that recruiting from out of state really means, and I think you're right, for several years, a decade or more going forward, that we're kind of stealing them from other states, if you will. Another way to accomplish the green line is through tax policy. And I think Oregon and the Portland region may be getting to the limit on that with progressive tax policy. But I'd like your thoughts on that question as well.
The question on, are we reaching our limits in terms of the progressive tax policy?
Yes. That's one way of achieving a higher share for labor.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, it's easy to say our taxes are high. I think the question is really, what are the levels of service we're trying to provide, and how do those levels of service deliver value? And so it's not ever a question of just, have we reached the limit? I think it's a question of, what are the benefits versus the costs? Because we are certainly on the high end of the taxation spectrum, but if we're delivering benefits that are commensurate with that are intentional and can actually deliver lasting benefits, then that's a reasonable conversation to engage in.
This isn't a conversation necessarily about taxation, but I would add that I think it's helpful to think about why we're at the high end and what structural components in our tax system are driving us to a situation where we might have challenges that make it difficult for us to kind of provide effective and efficient services that are derived actually from the way our taxes are structured. And that's a conversation for another moment. As it relates to economic development, I think the theory that is starting to emerge out of here that we're hoping to be able to continue to kick around with you all is really we need to get, we're in a particular pivotal moment in time when we need to get to a both and strategy. Instead of saying we have to have a conversation about whether we're focusing on supporting existing small businesses and their growth, or we're trying to bring in new businesses from outside, we need to be in a position where we're doing both. Instead of thinking about, are we focused exclusively on increasing productivity and GDP, or are we focused on wages and compensation, we need to be looking at both. It's a moment when we need to bring nuance into the conversation, and we need to really step back and think about where our policies interact with all of those various complicated components. If it's going to be difficult for us to bring in over the next, if we are looking at the projections, at least next 5 years, very difficult for us to compete, to bring in new jobs. We definitely need to keep focusing on trying to do that, in particular where it interacts with a cluster strategy that makes sense for us. But maybe we should be putting more resources on supporting the industries that we already have here, where we know there are going to be high replacement rates because we're seeing a lot of potential for retirement, and we know there's going to be near-term opportunities to move people into jobs. So sort of layering all of those together and thinking about how we sequence out actions and where we focus near-term versus how we set ourselves up for what will be more successful longer-term.
Councilor Lewis?
Sure, thank you. When I think about the opportunity to grow our labor share, I do think it is about looking after clusters and looking at places where we can intentionally measure and move the dial. But also looking at those bar charts where other states are doing it better. And in particular, the top two were arts and entertainment and then education. And while Metro may be able to say some statements about what happens in education, both the higher ed and the K-12 systems are heavily reliant on state direction and don't care what this dais says. That is not true for arts and entertainment, where we are currently holding some of the market, where we are exiting the market in a way that is probably going to be harmful to labor share. And frankly, at the end of the day, where we do have some traction in leadership, particularly when it comes to some of the work we've been able to do with the film industry, I think we should develop an intentional strategy to recapture, or at least bring up to national average, labor share within that field, and make that a hallmark of our strategy to grow labor share in the metro region. Yeah.
Councilor Simpson?
Thank you, President Wong. Thank you for this. I am grappling just a bit because the information you presented, the data, and aggregately, like every community, I feel like that a lot of data has been overlooked for a long time, particularly for communities of color and Black communities. And I would like for us to acknowledge that, because you don't get communities that are in this position or stagnant or going in opposite directions. If you knew that information in real time at the time, you would have adjusted, but it was ignored. So I want to acknowledge that, because now we're addressing issues and fixing issues because leadership didn't do what they were supposed to do in that moment, in that time. I really grapple with economic development, particularly in this place, because, again, the populations are small. It's easy to really go in and, with intention, to really go in and help a community, but it seems as though that has not been the case. But I will say this, those piss poor efforts cannot go on if we want to have a better region. Seriously. Like, I think about the folks in East County, the folks in Gresham, the folks in Troutdale, Fairview, Powell Butte, all of that, right? That live, work, service downtown, make our coffees, make our lunches, clean our buildings, and we don't make a concerted effort to really show up geographically and demographically in communities that need to be a part of this conversation and uplifted. I don't have any questions, but I knew you saw me just turning and twisting and turning this chair because I just can't stand hearing this information, knowing that past leadership just did absolutely nothing to help the communities that we are now seeking to help. And that just puts a tremendous amount of pressure on myself, my colleagues, you all to get something done right now when nothing was done 40, 30, 20 years ago to address the issues when they were arising. Let's do something now. Instead of being in conversation, because academics versus getting it on the ground, let's actually come up with implementation plans to show up in communities and share this information. I know folks in Rockwood would love to hear about what y'all are talking about, but they don't have the opportunity to do that because they're making them coffees and them lunches and cleaning them buildings. So let's be mindful. I don't have anything else.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Well, I was going to ask some other questions, but I do have to follow up on Councilor Simpson's questions. One of the questions to you would be, what is the appropriate entity to make those action plans to deal with some of this? But I think a lot of it gets back to education. I wasn't entirely satisfied with your answer on the education because I think education is much more key. And I noticed that in talking about economic development, we haven't talked about the educational component and where we do. And I want to focus particularly on the healthcare sector. Your charts noted, first of all, that the healthcare sector is one that we're going to be facing a lot of retirements. It's also been one of the most robust hiring economies, and it's also one economy where we don't seem to have a very robust educational performance plan to train people up into that sector and to boost that sector. So that gets to the whole question of what kind of strategies. Do we need particular strategies to tie our education sector better into some of these clusters, that particular cluster? I mean, we've spent a lot of effort and we have somebody who has put a lot of personal money into developing our health sciences capacity in this area. And I'm just wondering if that's a particular area that might be something that we need to focus on. And there's other clusters that we might need to work on as well. You talk about the entertainment or about the creative industry. I think that's another one that we have to deal with. So I would have to listen to this presentation 2 or 3 times to really understand all the implications. And I don't think we have that time today. I could ask you to sit here till 6, but I don't think that's going to work. So I appreciate it. I'm just things to think about.
Yeah.
And if you want to respond on the educational sector.
Yeah, on the education piece, I think, a lens through the healthcare sector is really helpful. And I probably have 300 slides that I've put together in here. And so one slide is this notion of where do we have headwinds, where do we have tailwinds? Tailwinds is absolutely in healthcare. It's the only sector that, if we use traditional measures, has been growing jobs nationally and here locally. And Oregon's growth is disproportionate. So we are growing faster than other places. And because it is one of the highest labor share industries, that tailwind is an opportunity to lean into through like everything you were saying around educational opportunities, replacement, et cetera. That is a tailwind that is going to be beneficial to growing labor share. And I think being intentional about understanding that and then tracking that is certainly a strong possibility for an intervention.
But the question is, who should lead that to get us more intentionality in our educational system to tap into that tailwind? And maybe it's Metro, or maybe Metro has a role, I don't know. This is a question that I wrestle with, but I don't have an answer.
Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. First, I want to pick up just where you were with healthcare and the tailwinds there. That yes, it's a high labor share profession because it's all people delivering services. So it's people plus tech, and that's it. But it is one of the slightly red bars. It's not in the green. So we're still behind. So even in that growth, how do we flip from green to red? Or at least neutral? And then additionally, what is our structural advantage that is giving us this lead in labor share? It feels a little bit like it might be tied to some minimum wage and some lack of a sales tax, but like we should take it 2 layers down in the onion, both around minimum wage and tax policy.
I oftentimes refer to this as my second dissertation. I have lots of regressions trying to get at exactly what you are saying and have looked into minimum wage and can say definitively it is one of the reasons that we have. It's not the dominant reason, but it is positively contributing, and we can kind of get some relative estimates of how much more minimum wage, contributes. So yes, absolutely, there's a lot more we can do here and learn, but even with some deeper diving, we are starting to see some tangible things that we can point to.
Okay, thank you. Oh, but back to the question of within a sector, how do you move from red to green? How do you become more like the other industries where we are dominant in the national landscape? Is it policy, or is it a charismatic leader or charismatic industry leader saying this is a new planting of a flagpole?
I think it's all of the above. I think when you look at Oregon in particular, the industries where we have a larger share is typically the places where we are kind of worldwide leaders. So you think about OHSU as an opportunity to look at in the same way you have Nike and Intel here, because you're able to command talent through premium wages is one strategy. But I think, again, OHSU in the relative scheme of the entire metro region is probably pretty meaningful in the scheme of the state, maybe not as impactful. But I think, again, understanding, is it a firm within an industry strategy? Is it a broad-based educational opportunity? Is it understanding how to leverage AI, productivity, and capital investments to better serve? Those are all, I think, the foundational questions today.
Or the distribution of jobs within the industry, right? I mean, there's tech, and those are all captured in the same bar, right? So if we have more on one side than on the other, it would affect the overall labor share. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for all the data. I think that's what helps us make informed policy decisions. And Laurel, I think you really challenged us to think about our theory of action. If you actually go back in the bullpen in the staff office, there's a big board that's like, what is our theory of action?
Yay!
It is actually pretty sparse, but it's up there and people are writing down their comments. But it's pretty clear that we need to develop that strategy. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, I want to ask you what our theory of action should be. I think you said that that's not your role, but how do we, what's the process by which we do that, right? And we have so many different players that do economic development. Everyone has their own niche or role, but is it the SEDS? It's how do we arrive at the shared understanding of how we want to have good growth? And I think that's we can have the best strategy that makes the most academic sense, but if we don't have buy-in from our region, it's not going to go anywhere. So what's your recommendation of how that process goes and what the players are?
And that last part that you said, I think, is really the most important, because Oregon and the Portland metro area, we're very much function like an ecosystem, right? I mean, there's a lot of players, and making sure that everyone understands what their roles are and what part of the action plan they're leaning into is really critical. And the nearest term opportunity is the SEDS. And I think what we're trying to do here, I know you're partnered on that with GPI and trying to think about how to move that forward. And there will be data and information coming forward about clusters and industry profiles and et cetera. And to the extent that you can layer onto that questions about, well, what do we know about the labor share for these? What do we know about what kind of existing businesses we have that we could be supporting and growing within these clusters? How do we think about how our traded sector pieces can come in? Sort of layering in the questions that we're trying to bring forward here will help to move the action plan to a place where it's more focused on kind of equity in its outcomes. And then I said this before, I guess I'll say it again. It's not a simple moment, and it therefore can't have a simple answer. And really trying to think about how we get into that both and analysis in a moment when resources are also constrained. So we have to be thoughtful about where we're really putting our priorities is going to require some deeper questioning and deeper conversation across partners. And I think as you move into the actual implementation of it, better coordination on who's doing what and how the resources are braiding together. So it's not a straightforward moment, and I don't think anything in that presentation should have led you to believe that the answer is a straightforward answer. It's a moment for nuance.
That's very helpful. President Gonzalez, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, thank you. I was just loving this conversation. So grateful that we have the brightest minds in Oregon spending some time with us. So what some of the things I'm taking away from the presentation and that I've heard in other spaces, and just to confirm, we're one of the least unequal states. Is that kind of fair to say, given our historic policy framework?
I think that's needs more investigation. I think what's from a labor share perspective,
Okay.
the potential to be unequal exists. Whether it actually is an outcome, I think, is very much different by race, ethnicity, by location, certainly by industry. But the opportunity, I think, is you want to be in that place because it allows you the opportunity to actually be intentional about that. But I don't know that we're achieving the outcomes that would make that statement solidified.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, maybe I didn't frame it correctly, but I think in terms of like extreme disparity from like extreme wealth to extreme poverty, we're kind of I don't know if our bands are as wide. But anyway, I appreciate your answer. I think it's good context, and we keep hearing a lot of the conversation, the K-shaped economy, and I want to segment my next question into kind of frontier technologies, artificial intelligence, and asked about productivity a little bit earlier. But one of the things that like I'm kind of trying to look into the crystal ball and discern is, with the level of technology advancement, is work even going to be a thing? Is that the right measure for us in the future? And to that extent, like the role of tools like universal basic income or economic distribution. I think that's like an interesting thing. I would be curious to hear your thoughts. And kind of similar in the kind of same category, kind of this technological revolution that we're living through, like one of the major waves of revolution in terms of our economies in the country, is these revolutions also create conditions for hyper concentration of capital in the industries that are emerging. And so I'm wondering, like, Oregon, national, how do we start to think about some of these elements that might be shifting just even fundamentally how we think about people working and industries as they go forward? Hopefully that is kind of clear enough.
Maybe I'll say something and then you can weigh in. I'm doing my best to keep tabs on this conversation nationally, and what I'm observing is probably the same thing that you're observing, which is that literally nobody knows how this is going to play out. And you're certainly right that the conditions do feel like they are ripe for a concentration of capital in a way that would increase economic disparities and lead to a widening of a K-shaped economy. And I think the question for us to be thinking about here in the Portland metro region is what can we do here, given the degree of uncertainty and the levers that we can actually pull independently? Because if we move independently toward some solution that feels like it might be the right solution, that puts a lot of pressure on our revenue structure and creates sort of tension with neighboring communities where those same solutions might not exist, right? I mean, I think the question that you're asking is what's the correct geographic scale for a response to the technological changes that we're seeing. And it just feels like the region can't do a lot to set itself up in that, at least not given the degree of uncertainty that we have with it right now. And that the unintended consequences are unpredictable and could be difficult. That's not to say we should do nothing. I think we have to be very aware of what's going on and continue to think about how the social safety net that we already provide, the service provision that that we have always prioritized, those things are probably going to be having more pressure on them if the hypothesis that we're talking about in this scenario is accurate. And we're going to need to continue to do that. But in terms of massive policy shifts that we can implement locally here, I'm not aware of any. Mike, maybe you have different thoughts.
No,
This is where we disagree with each other in public, so go ahead.
we agree. You said more eloquently what I was going to say. I think the only thing I would add is, again, looking at the risk for disruption, I think, can be our most helpful tool. And so if we have tailwinds that are less likely to be disrupted, for example, in healthcare, that we can at least have more certainty and leverage around that versus trying to move a mountain or lean into a massive headwind that we have a limited ability to control. So I think in this moment is really about understanding with great uncertainty, where are the targeted interventions where we think we can achieve a return, and let's focus at least on those, and then maybe try to think about some bigger moves that might be more challenging to execute.
There's also the sort of industry component of it of, how are advancements that come from AI likely to increase productivity in some of the industries that are already strong in our region? And again, that's a place where I don't think we know what the answer is, but I would hold that question going into the SEDS process if I were in your seats and see if there's anything that can come forward.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think the AI has the potential probably to both increase productivity, but also completely, wipe out legacy companies. And so it's kind of a double-edged blade, right? And which leads to my last question. I mean, I would love to follow up with you and just keep learning from you if that's okay. One of the things that we're constantly thinking about on the Metro Council, and I think a lot of Oregon policymakers are hopefully thinking about as well, is this basic question that keeps bringing you back to us, which is, what is our role in economic development? What is our role in creating prosperity for Oregonians? What is the value of someone raising a family here, of starting a business here, of retiring here, right? Like, there's so many places in the world to live, but what is our specific framework that we want to offer for people? I think one of the tensions that I have been trying to unravel in the different kinds of economic ec dev philosophies that are out there is kind of the role of innovation and also kind of the attraction of new industries, which kind of, I think, creates like this race to the bottom phenomenon that we've seen across like states competing with each other for that sense. How much do you think in terms of kind of what we've been talking about within this realm of changing industries and AI, that our local governments should be thinking about kind of creating the next frontier industry versus trying to attract some of these kind of race to the bottom-y companies, et cetera? Or is it all the things, all of the above? We should be throwing everything at everything. And this is probably going to be something we really focus on in the SEDS, but I'm curious what you think is the kind of value that we should approach in terms of creating that value proposition for what it means for someone to stay in Oregon and to grow in Oregon. Because I think we're seeing a lot of, not to get overly political, but a lot of blue states are losing population and investment and, going to red states. And as a result, I think in 2030, we're going to lose a lot of congressional seats in blue states. And so, people and growth is power in this country, right? And so people are voting with their feet. And I'm trying to understand at a big picture, where is it that we should be thinking about that value proposition in terms of the kind of jobs and creativity that we want to see here? And that's my last question. I know it's a really big one.
you want me to go first? Okay. Well, you can ask probably 10 different people who are involved in the economic development industry that question and probably get 10 different answers. So I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it. And I am indexing on the presentation that we just saw, which suggests that competition is going to be very challenging. I mean, we are literally moving into a situation where growth is zero sum, right? Where for us to win, someone else has to lose. That is the situation that we are advancing toward. And so that idea of bringing in new traded sector, it's absolutely critical because that is how you can most effectively and efficiently get new money into the region. So I would never say don't spend time on it. But I do think it has to be very targeted. You really have to think about where you're most likely to have success, where we have competitive and comparative advantages as a region that make it likely that an industry from out of state would want to locate here, and focus really only on those sort of limited opportunities. Otherwise, I mean, I spent, I don't know what was I here for an hour last time showing slide after slide that showed disparities by race, gender, and ethnicity in the economy currently, with the headline that we've got a lot of talent sitting on the sidelines. How do we activate that? What does our entrepreneurship ecosystem look like? How do we think about how we're supporting small business growth? Businesses that are already here that might need to scale from small to mid-sized but need a capital investment. How do we connect them to resources, whether private or public investment dollars, to help to make that happen? To me, in the near term, and I'm thinking of the near term, like the next 5 years or so, that feels like the easier and more effective place to be focusing the majority of our efforts. Again, there are many people out there who would probably disagree and have a different perspective on it, but as I'm looking at the landscape and what's going on with the macro economy and the degree of uncertainty, that's where I'm landing.
Thanks. But Mike, before you answer, I think I'm really I'm writing in my notebook here, and I just circled growth is zero sum, kind of in your perspective. I think it's a big deal because I know there's a lot of people that don't want us to kind of play in that game that other states are playing in, whether it's incentives or whatever. And so we might not be the most aggressive offensive in terms of our strategy, but it does make me think about how we need to at least have an incredibly sophisticated defensive approach. I mean, we all hear stories of businesses getting called, 3 times a year to relocate somewhere. And so we should at least have this philosophy of keeping and strengthening what we have at a minimum. So I just, growth is zero sum is my takeaway, one of my main takeaways from this.
Because everyone's trying to grab our people too, right? So when we're thinking about incentives, it should be to support our existing businesses as well as attract new ones. And ideally, the same incentive base would work for both purposes. But
Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Catherine, do you want to close this out?
Thank you so much, Deputy Council President Wong. I really want to thank all of you as council members for engaging in this conversation in such a deep way. I'd like to thank our guests for presenting this data. And I asked Georgia to take us back to a slide that I actually skipped at the beginning, because I'd like to just use that as a way to wrap up. I said early on that our experts were not going to tell us what good growth is, and they repeatedly did not tell us what good growth is through the course of this conversation. That said, you all have pulled out some threads that I will commit to you will, as a department and working closely with our GAP-D partners and our housing partners and our COO office partners, we will try to clarify some of those threads and understand what the inquiries are and bring them back to you. But I wanted to just focus back on the economic development guidance that you gave us at the beginning of this year. I mentioned we'll bring back job-ready lands. We talked a lot, and Lorelei, I appreciate your focus on the SEDS. I want to be careful not to put too much weight on that as as something that's going to save us, but I think you gave us some very concrete ways to think about that work, and I'm grateful for that, and we will do that. And then I really want to point to numbers 3 and 4, because I think the this type of conversation is building the muscle to do what those things say we want to do, which is really start to have a strategic economic development focus, or maybe we would call it an economic prosperity focus, into our ongoing work. So as we've been talking today, I've been thinking about the SEDS, I've been thinking about the housing affordability work we heard earlier. I've been thinking about the data work that we do, and Councillor Simpson really thinking, what could we as Metro do to make that actionable, that request that you put out there. I've been thinking about this concept of an entrepreneurship ecosystem and how that connects to our construction careers work, and whether there might be other ways we can think about that. So just really appreciate you all giving us some ways to flex that muscle, to build it and flex it. And then I wanted to also just look at that number 4, which is it's counselor and staff participation in these leadership roles. It says organizations there, but I think it's much more than organizations. It's really starting to understand in the regional conversation about economic development, how does Metro fit in with convening, with funding, and with policy leadership, and how can we build on what we're learning and talking about here into the future over the next couple of years. So thank you again. Thank you all, and just really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for spending the morning with us. I know it might be a long morning, but you did great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to COO Communications.
Thank you, Deputy Council President Wong. Today, I just wanted to invite Michelle Ruffin up for an update on some outreach and engagement. Innovative, I would say, outreach and engagement that she has been working on with the help of a few of you. So, thank you.
Thank you. For the record, Michelle Ruffin, Regional Investment Strategy Manager. It's good to see all of you. Thanks for inviting me to give a quick update, and I should just say thank you, Councillor Lewis, for this opportunity. I wanted to share, you all had received a presentation from some of us in GAPD and Parks and Nature last month, June, and were shared on the Parks and Nature Levy Communications and Engagement Plan Summary. So I'm just referencing some of that because in that plan, some of the things we named for you were what you're gonna see in the coming months as we move through our work plan on Parks and Nature Levy prep is more visible avenues for storytelling, clear and compelling materials, stronger partnerships, and more built-in capacity internally for us to build champions for this work. So I wanted to share an update in that vein on some of the community outreach efforts that we've been leading as we committed to in that plan. And as you all know, no matter where people live in the region, a resounding message we hear is that Parks and Nature is a big part of what makes this place special. And so we went out this last weekend. I guess I'll just say too, we're really leaning into our communications and engagement work. I think you probably know this, but we're leaning into the experimental side of things like door-to-door outreach, community canvas work, because we're in this important moment in time where it's the summertime. There's an understanding that voters expect to be communicated with, and really gaining some feedback from members of the public in an important step as we orient ourselves to future investment work. So that said, this last weekend, we were both out tabling at the Oregon City First City celebration, and a few of us on the team also broke off and did some door-to-door outreach just up the hill there in Oregon City, and spoke with folks at their door about our Parks and Nature system, what the levy currently provides for us today, and had some really wonderful conversations. Councillor Lewis, you were with us, so you'll probably share more. I think the things I wanted to name were that we had at least 16 live conversations with residents in Oregon City. There were 4 of us from Metro who were part of the group, including Councillor Lewis. Thank you. And folks really were eager to speak with us, right? I think every person speaks through the lens of their own experience, right? And I don't want to speak to any sort of statistical analysis about any of it, but I think the larger thing together is that as we think about future opportunities to have conversations with folks about the impact of our levy and our work here at Metro, that we capitalize on those opportunities. And then maybe I'll pause and see if Councilor Lewis wants to share more, but thank you. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. I just want to lift up the willingness of folks in this agency to figure out new ways to reach people. We're a regional government, so very few people understand us or know which door to knock on. So it's kind of fun to flip the script and knock on their door. The opportunity to listen and listen deeply is there. And, you know, I looked at the number of doors we were able to hit and number of people that we spoke with. And then I talked to the people who stayed at the tent, and they were doing a clicker. And while you recorded that we had 16 live conversations, I would say that included more than 16 individuals, because sometimes it was like a parent-child, a couple. I think we were at 16, whereas the clicker was at like 23. So like person-hour conversation, almost the same, like kind of statistically the same. And the opportunity to hear directly from people how they think of parks. And yes, I heard a lot about trails, even after our polling said trails are something that's hard to talk about. People are anxious to talk about trails. People are also thinking about park use and like youth and families and how they use parks, even if they were not a parent or actively parenting. So just really exciting to be able to go out, and I wanted to lift that up because I know we've got some crazy number of engagements this summer at festivals and at conferences in order to help people with future vision as well as the parks. But I think this is a tool that we should lean in more to. I do think there's probably some refinement of how we present ourselves. There was one couple when we said, "Hi, we're here knocking on your door from Metro." They thought we were the garbage police and that they had inadequately disposed of something. So we had to explain we were not there to cite them for a garbage problem. But, you know, real experience that some people will experience fear or resentment when you knock on the door and say, "Hi, we're from the government." But when you say, "Look, we're here to actually listen to how you engage with that park that's just right there," that sets off a little light. So let's do more of it.
Great.
And thank you for presenting this work.
Of course. Can I share another very fun little story as well? That when we were knocking doors, one of the residents also had, you know, shared some important thoughts about like, "I love our parks. I love what you all do. Thanks for sharing with me a little bit about what the levy does. I learned something." And then we handed one of our I think it is one of the maps that district maps that we have, or handouts, and that resident, like, he started laughing and we were like, what's going on? And he's like, "My daughter is with the two pictured on this actual map." So like, just gives you a sense of how small the world can be, but also how joyful some of those conversations can be when folks are connecting the dots between this is very impactful and look, my family is actually that there's something directly impacting me that I should be talking with you all about. Just, it was great. It's good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all I had.
Okay. Any council communications? Councilor Lewis?
Sure, just wanted to share, I was able to attend the groundbreaking for the Clackamas County Recovery Campus yesterday. So bringing lots of excitement to that facility that will be made possible through federal investment, state investment, as well as SHS.
Okay, well, seeing no further discussion, the council meeting is adjourned. I hope everyone is able to focus on their district priorities during our August recess, and we'll reconvene after Labor Day. Our next regular meeting is scheduled for September 8th at 10 a.m. Have a great break, y'all.